welcome back to the Covey Wellness Center podcast. We are excited to have you here joining us on season 3, where we are focusing on authors and writers, mostly local to our geographic area, and people who are writing in spaces with a particular interest and intersection with the work that we're doing here at Covey Wellness Center. And so today, our beautiful guest, Toni Nieuwhof, is no exception. She is writing in the space where many people find themselves right before they're seeking couples counseling, which of course is something that we do here at the center. And she has written a book on marriage called Before You Split, which is really an invitation to consider this decision with all of the information and all of the thoughtfulness before rushing to splitting a relationship. And I think that's a space where so many of our listeners might be finding themselves, and certainly our clients as well. And so she has a lot to add from her own expertise and experience, and also her personal story. And so thank you so much, Toni, for agreeing to be with us here today. I know our listeners are going to enjoy this conversation. I know it's going to be wonderful for me. And we're just so thankful that you're here.
Hey, Sarah, I just love what you're doing, and it honestly is a thrill and an honor to join you. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, we're going to get right into it. But before we do that, if you can just tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, a little bit of biographical details, just so people can kind of place you in context. And then we'll get to our sort of topic of choice for today.
Sure. Well, my husband, Carrie, and I have been married for almost 34 years. We have 2 boys, 2 grown sons who are out in the world, independent. We're a close family. We love spending time with our kids and their partners. Carrie and I met all those years ago at law school. So we have gone through this career with winding, twisting paths. He became a pastor. I worked as a lawyer in different capacities in health law and then in family law. And more recently, I've been working as an author, speaker, and family law mediator. So I said we took a few twists and turns. We have, and we went through a very long, difficult season in our marriage before I practiced family law. So that was part of the impetus for really focusing in on how I might be able to combine the experience I had as a family lawyer and what we experienced personally and put it together into the book Before You Split.
Right. Yeah, it's such a great resource for people in that sense, because you are able to look at that objectively, which is really hard to do. So you're sharing personally and vulnerably, but also from a standpoint of what's going to serve the reader from my story. I know in therapy, we talk about self-disclosure and how it can be a really helpful tool as long as it's serving the person that it is being offered to. And I think you've done a really beautiful job in the book of doing that and saying, we want to anchor this in a real life story of we're married people too. We went through this season and we navigated all of the things, or maybe many of the things that so many others are navigating. And there's hope and there's resources and there's wisdom. And here are some things you can reflect on. And I even like the structure of the book where there at the end of each chapter, there's some reflection questions to really go deep into what it is that people are wanting in their relationship. And that, self-directed guidance or couple-directed, if you will, guidance can be so helpful. So I would love to hear a little bit more about that sort of origin story. I know with every author that I talk to, it's sort of, this book was birthed, and you've touched on this a little bit, this book was birthed out of a particular experience. And sometimes people will say it's the book that I needed, that I'm now writing for others, that sort of thing. So I wonder if you could speak to that origin story and even maybe touch on that introductory story from the book around your wedding ring and sort of that turning point for you that represented, a choice about a pathway forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, the downward spiral of conflict that my husband and Carrie found ourselves in several years into our marriage was not what we were expecting. I mean,
No.
we met in law school. We were both, we both were on board with the plan that Kerry was going to finish law school and then he was going to go to seminary. And we ended up taking, he took a 3-point charge, which is three churches banded together for survival, hired him as a student. And so we hit the ground running and we had all the things up in the air. I had when we moved up to this area where the churches are located, I had a 3.5-year-old son. Carrie had 3 days of school in the city in Toronto. And
Hmm.
so he was back and forth. And I was working as pharmacist at that time. I'm also a pharmacist. So at that point, I was
Right.
working in pharmacy. And we just had so many things that we were juggling, helping 3 churches to grow Carrie studies. And so we really failed to pay attention to what was happening between us in
Mm.
our communication styles. They were so very different. Our personalities really are very different. And
Yes.
our emotional capacities were very undeveloped at that stage.
Mm.
We lacked mentors. I mean, there were many different reasons that now I can look back and say, aha, with 2020 hindsight, I can see why we struggled so deeply. But
Hmm.
and of course, I will admit it, we were both proud enough to think that my perspective is the normal one. And well, I think you're not quite normal.
Right.
But we didn't say it that calmly. We ended up spinning into conflict
Mm.
over the many different details of our busy lives. And it really got worse before it got better. And
Mm.
so we did find ourselves at one point where uh, we were trying to maintain our connection, but we had this constant tension that just simmered under the surface, kind of like
Okay.
a steaming pot of water on the stove that, is right there, just about at boiling point. And,
Yeah.
the lid rattles around a bit, and then it doesn't take much of a temperature increase to just blow the lid off the pot and all the steam flow,
Yes.
flies out,
Yes,
spreads out
absolutely.
everywhere. And that's how it was with our conflict. We just had this constantly simmering
Mm.
tension under the surface. I mean, our kids' caregiver, who spent a lot of time at our house with our family, secretly called us the Bickersons
Oh,
and didn't
wow.
tell us for years.
Hmm. I think that a lot of people could relate to that. Like, I know we're just partway into the story, but I'm listening and thinking of the couples that I work with and so many where there is just this palpable tension that's just simmering, like you
Hmm.
said. That's a great analogy where
Hmm.
it doesn't take much to have that tipping point. And really that's your capacity has been chipped away at maybe over years of conflict and arguments and maybe bitter seeds of bitterness and things like that that just build and build
Hmm.
and build. And then there's about this much space before something kind of puts you over the edge into,
Hmm.
a lack of self-control or, argumentation or whatever. And it's just that emotional boiling point gets hit, right? And
Hmm.
I think there's so many people who find themselves with a number of unnamed things, as you're saying, in their
Yes.
relationship that are very
Hmm.
real and having an impact on the relationship, but they're not
Hmm.
really spoken in a healing way into the space of the relationship. And so they just are this weight that is sitting there on everyone's hearts, and
Hmm. Hmm.
I think that's unfortunately a fairly common story. And I think it is not even an intentional story. As you said, you're just so
Hmm.
busy with life and kids and the demands of jobs and schooling and goals that you're just moving forward the best you can. And then it all kind of gets to a point where
Hmm.
that's not going to be possible anymore without
Yes.
change.
Yes, yes. And in that the irresolvable differences between us at that point in time. I mean, there are many different ways to look at personalities and what happens in conflict and the analogies that we draw. But one of them that I've heard that resonates for what was happening with Carrie and I is the skunk and the turtle.
Oh, I
So,
haven't heard this
that,
one.
oh, okay. So
Tell me about it.
the skunk is the verbal processor, the one who, has many words. And so what happens in conflict is the skunk just spews everywhere.
Okay.
And
Yes.
with wild abandon.
Yes.
And then the
Yes.
turtle withdraws into the hard shell, and it doesn't matter how hard you kick that shell, they're not coming out. And so
Right.
that I think is a pretty apt description of what was happening with Carrie and I in those early days. And we
Mm,
lacked the self-awareness to see that this was a pattern that we needed to get underneath, but we played it over and over again. And the
yes.
one day that you mentioned the time when I pulled the ring off my finger and threw it on the
Mm-hmm.
floor.
Mm-hmm.
So we had been trying desperately to still maintain our connection, build into our marriage. We knew that much. We would have date nights, but the date nights were turning into fight night in those days.
Mm.
It really
Yeah.
wasn't going well. So we thought, okay, let's shake up the dynamic, and we'll go out for a lunch date instead of waiting for Friday night. We chose a Wednesday afternoon. Carrie picked me up at the hospital where I was working at that point, and we as I got into the car, Carrie was scowling and he said, "You said 15 minutes ago." And that was true. But
Mm.
I had a position at the hospital where I was responsible for all kinds of programs. And one of the doctors had stopped me, and I couldn't
Get away.
just, yes, I
Sure.
had to have this conversation. I know their time is limited and mine is too. So by the time I got there, I was late, and I didn't respond well. Carrie was scowling. That was enough to blow the lid off the pot.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to become self-defensive, and it just deteriorated from there. And we escalated. And finally, I was so frustrated. I was crying once again,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
feeling stuck, didn't know what to do with all the emotions. And so in a flash, I just ripped the ring off my finger and I threw it at his feet. And I said, "I don't want this anymore."
Mm. Wow.
And at that time, we were hitting the bottom of
Mm.
our dysfunctions, our ability to try to dig ourselves out of that pit on our own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was a painful moment, but it was also motivating because I recognized that we could not go on this way. And
Right.
both of us recognized that. And I think that was the trigger point for us to dig into counseling.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly can't recall whether I had done one or two sessions before this point.
Mm-hmm.
But, there's a difference. And I'm sure you see this, Sarah, when somebody comes in or when a couple comes in for help with counseling, and it's clear that their main agenda is to get your to bring you over to their side,
Yes. Get
to
allegiance with
say
them.
yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, come on, be aligned with me, tell me that you see what I'm seeing and that you're on my side, and that
Yes.
you also agree that he's being a
Unreasonable or.
crazily unreasonable person. And
Mm-hmm.
so I had sessions like that at the beginning, but once we really started to hit the bottom of the pit, I realized that uh, pride was not going to serve me well, that I
Mm-hmm.
actually needed to go into these counseling sessions with my hands open, palms up, to
Mm.
find out, to ask, what am I contributing to this? And to
Right.
learn what I needed to do to turn things around.
Yeah, that's so important. I think, and it's difficult with couples counseling as well because not you don't always arrive at that point at the same point in time as a couple, and your readiness for counseling doesn't always just perfectly align. I mean, it makes logical sense that that would be true because obviously you're having conflict. So you're not feeling aligned or attuned in your relationship. So we often see one person, sort of almost dragging the other person. So there's this, come along because I know we need it, but you're not there yet, but I'm going to make you come. And so it's a really delicate place to create enough space for people to find themselves mutually committed to the process and wanting to do the things that are required, which does involve a lot of vulnerability and humility. And when you're in a relationship with a lot of conflict, that's a very scary thing to enter into because your heart has been broken and you're sad and you're protective, casing around your heart and your hard-heartedness, some people might say it's not because you're really trying to not be a compassionate person. It's because you're scared and hurt. And to
Yes.
risk that in a session when you've risked it before and the response has been contempt or criticism or something that doesn't take you to a healing place, that's a very hard thing. And so I think it is important to really recognize the safety and the vulnerability and the humility that is needed to actually engage in couples counseling. Like it's not easy. It's not easy, particularly if you're coming in a crisis. I mean, I would love for couples to just have a counselor in their, you know, core healthcare team that they go to when and keeping accounts small and coming with little things and just equipping themselves along the way. But let's face it, most people do have to hit a rock bottom spot before they'll say, I think it's time for us to have some help here because we've exhausted what we think we can try and we're not able to leverage this to something good. And we're sort of desperate, right? So there's some
Hmm.
beauty in that desperation, even though it's so hard, because I think we are surrendered and maybe open to try some
Hmm.
things, to hear from others, um, and maybe not white knuckling as much, like you're saying with the open
Right.
hands, we're opening up a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it is a delicate, very vulnerable space. And, you mentioned earlier that it was a long season. I think that's how it is for a lot of people. Like
Mm.
this is not an instant come to a couple of couple sessions and things are, wonderful again, any more than going to a few sessions at the gym is going to change your, couch potato body to somebody ready to compete in a marathon or something. Right. So
Sure. Yes.
it is a process and the commitment to that process um, is a good kind of hard. That's how I like to
Hmm.
describe that. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So tell us a little bit more about where you see. I mean, I see this all the time, and I think healthy marriages are built on foundations of healthy people. And lots of times we have people coming in for marriage counseling, and then there are things that come forward that are really individual issues that are impacting the space of the relationship. And so we're often doing combinations of individual work and couples work to try and distinguish that. Because, of course, in couples therapy, the health of the relationship or the relationship itself is the client versus the
Hmm.
individual. And so I wonder from your perspective where you see marriage or relational breakdown in these intimate relationships, intersecting with the wellness journeys of people. Where do you see that
Hmm.
um, affecting or maybe that interdependent relationship on your own personal wellness and your relational wellness? Love to hear you talk a bit
Hmm.
about that.
Yeah, that was a learning journey for Carrie and I. In my own, I mean, I certainly see, and as a family lawyer, uh, sat with clients whose mental health was suffering, or they have a spouse whose mental health was suffering, and
Right.
it has a huge impact on the marriage. And I think that uh, I don't know. It just seems like mental health struggles are so ubiquitous right now that I don't know
Yes.
that any marriage is really ever completely free from mental health struggles over the course of a marriage,
Right.
especially a long-term marriage. So
Yes.
Carrie and I, uh, when we were married, we really had no thoughts, no self-awareness around what we had come from and in our childhood experiences. It was something that was uncovered for us, I would say, literally several years into our marriage.
Mm,
And there, for me personally, I had gone through the childhood trauma of being raised by an alcoholic parent
mm,
and also one who had anger issues,
mm-hmm.
and very much an emotionally isolated upbringing. So you put those factors together, and there are impacts. There are definite mental health impacts that I
Mm-hmm.
really was not aware of until I was in my early 30s. I
Right,
literally had the defense mechanisms, the busyness in my life, the the role at work, and I had really not much time for reflection and no reason to take myself there. I
right.
honestly was
If we're
clueless.
moving forward, even if it's
Hmm.
not great, I don't have to face this, or I don't have to look at this or examine this in any way.
Yes, and just to be fair, I mean, that was at a time when we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the communications tools we do right now. And counseling was not as prominent
No.
as an option. I mean, it was there, but it was very much in the background. It wasn't something that people spoke about every day.
Well, there's still more stigma at that time, certainly.
Yes.
Yes.
Hmm.
And I
There
think that's
was.
a wonderful thing that as we're moving forward, it's becoming much more normalized that you have a
Yeah.
therapist in the same way you have a
Hmm.
massage therapist or a physiotherapist, that
Yes.
this is quite, you know, this is just a normal part of caring for your holistic self and your relationships and your family. But I agree. I think there were times where that was very much done under sort of lock and key and, very
Hmm.
secretive. And it wasn't, there was some shame maybe even in having to go to counseling,
Hmm.
which people can feel, and a sense of failure even around that, which of course I want to push back on, absolutely.
Sure.
But I do hear people say that, like they have a resistance to it because they feel they should be able to handle it on their own, and this is only for people who are a real mess, or
Yes.
both individual and couples counseling. And so I think that can play into people's readiness to try that, especially in those times when that's sort of the sense of things.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Well, I'm glad. I'm encouraged by how much the option of counseling is out there. I think I consider it to be an everyday thing right now. I can consider it to be completely without a stigma, but I know that,
Mm.
I can't speak for everyone. But at that point in time, it just wasn't even on my radar screen. I didn't have the thought that, oh, this could be helpful for me.
Right.
It wasn't until I had an episode where we were on vacation with our older son, who was then 3, and I had this episode where out of nowhere, I just broke down for about
Mm.
36 hours,
Wow.
weeping without understanding why. There was this deep despair. It came out of nowhere. I did
Mm.
not have a category or any understanding of what was going on. And I managed to pull myself together, and things were fine when I got back to Ontario. But at that point, I thought that happened for a reason, and I'm
Mm.
completely baffled. So I did start counseling once that happened. And
Hmm.
I tell this story because if there's anyone out there who's experiencing some overwhelming levels of emotion and you really
Hmm.
can't explain where they're coming from, please do get
Hmm.
in touch with a professional counselor, and
Hmm.
don't just leave it, or don't just leave it behind without trying to understand why it happened.
Right. Right. It's even with, with our any health issue, you want to go to root causes. You want to think about, I have these symptoms that I don't know how to explain. So can I have that orientation of curiosity to say, even though you're saying it came out of nowhere because it was a surprise to you, it probably didn't really come out of nowhere, right? And
Exactly. Yes, it
so
didn't.
it seems like
Yeah.
that, but
Hmm.
there's still a reason why your system is overloading and flooding in that way. So to be
Yes.
able to be curious and say, I would like to understand this, and heal this and, move forward, hopefully so that it doesn't happen again, or so that I'll know what to do if it does happen again and be equipped and not, maybe go as deeply into the despair or things like that. But we talk about disproportionate recurring reactions. So if you have
Hmm.
the helpful way for people to think about this is if you have a situation that maybe warrants a level 2 frustration, as an example, and you
Yes.
are at a level 10 frustration, like I shouldn't be, maybe this amount of anger isn't warranted for this particular situation. Or the alternatively, and it doesn't have to be anger. It could be tears. It could be sadness, but it's
Sure.
disproportionate to the event. And that could also be in hypoarousal, where I should be sad, but I'm not able to cry. Like I've had this
Hmm.
big loss
Yes.
and I have no contact with those emotions. So wherever you see that disparity between what would be sort of reasonable and warranted in a situation to feel a certain way and where the emotions are showing up, if that's
Hmm.
disproportional, and especially if you seeing patterns, that's a really great way to think there's something to be curious about here. There's something else going on that's taking me from a 2 to 10 or a 2
Hmm.
to -6, because there's a lack of alignment here with what just makes rational sense when I think about it objectively. And so
Hmm.
how do I learn from what those emotions are saying or what they're bringing forward in terms of how I'm doing and what I'm really dealing with, We can be very
Hmm.
dismissive of our emotions. Like if we get through them, which of course they're in waves, we ride the wave and then we're like, okay, I'm fine now. Right? Instead of
Hmm.
thinking, well,
Yes.
maybe there's something there.
Hmm. Well, in this case too, I had said, and my experience was it came out of nowhere. In fact, it was the first crack in the armor I had constructed around the traumatic experiences that really
Right.
kept them out of my view entirely. And so it needed to happen. I mean,
Hmm.
if it remains buried for years and years and years, it takes a toll on your body, on your life, on your
Hmm.
emotional health. And so it was good that I experienced that crack. But I came to realize that it didn't actually come out of nowhere.
Right. Right, for sure. And I think it speaks to when we look at patterns, like even going back to your skunk and turtle analogy, you can say, oh, look, like I'm not just turtling here. I'm turtling because I've learned these behaviors to defend myself against antagonism or against
Yes.
anger.
Hmm.
And it makes
Hmm.
sense that I'm retreating out of self protection. And that, yes, part of this is about my dynamic with Carrie, but part of this is also because I have had to survive some things
Hmm.
and navigate some things that have kept me protected. And which there's a lot of self compassion for that, then that comes
Hmm.
in,
Hmm.
right? And a lot of
Yes.
understanding and, right sizing the parts that are from patterns in childhood or personality, because there's so much that impacts how we behave in our relationships that's not really specific to the relationship. There's all these
Hmm.
other factors. And so when you start to tease that out, you gain a bit of understanding, you start to name it and diffuse some of that and then become
Yes.
equipped to handle it. So yeah,
Hmm.
I do find for sure that those intimate relationships, whether people are in couples counseling or not, but it's often those intimate relationships that will open up those cracks for them to do the work because they'll notice that they're not showing up. They'll say, I don't feel like myself, like I'm losing it all the time with my partner and
Yes.
I feel out of
Hmm.
control. But those intimate relationships where the vulnerabilities are real and the
Hmm.
safety is
Hmm.
so important, it will bring out things that maybe need attention. And so, like you say, it's a gift, even though it's so hard to navigate and you wouldn't wish to have to go through it. But that is another common story that people find themselves in. Something is bringing
Yes.
this about, and I have to figure it out because I can't move forward if I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really
Mm-hmm.
stuck. Yeah,
Yes.
wonderful. Well, I wonder if you could speak to the person who is struggling in your marriage. I know that your book absolutely, in their marriages, I should say. I know that the book really speaks to that person, to consider before you split, consider some things. And I know for me, when I'm speaking with couples who are coming in and they're really wrestling with that question of, is this the end? Is this an exit strategy kind of couples counseling, or is this a rebuilding kind of couples counseling? And the question I always put to them is, it's not an easy road, no matter which road you choose. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
road that's going to
Mm-hmm.
require a lot of learning and a lot of grief and a lot of growth. But whether you do that together or whether you do that apart, you can't escape those components of the road, right? It's a hard road. And so you have to decide really where you feel you want to put in that work and what hard road you're choosing, because you don't have an easy road. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's helpful for people because they may have an orientation to their situation that if I can just get rid of this person in my life, then everything
Mm-hmm.
will be okay. But it's not really how it is for people, right? There's a lot that goes on. And there's maybe this is an important spot too, to just talk a little bit about the distinction you also make in your book between an unhappy marriage and a harmful marriage. Would you speak to that
Mm-hmm.
just briefly so that we can coach this conversation with that provision as well? As I think that's an important distinction.
Sure. Yes. Yeah, because my book uh speaks to the couple who is struggling seriously the way we
Mm-hmm.
were, and helps to uncover various things that might help the situation. That if this rock was overturned, maybe that would make a difference. It's sort of a primer on various solutions
Mm-hmm.
to all kinds of issues that impact marriage. And so I encourage people to slow down and think about potentially rebuilding their marriage instead of leaving. But I always want the person who's listening, who is being harmed by their relationship, to be honest about the harm,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's uh, physical abuse, whether it's emotional abuse. If there's an abusive component or a lack of safety in your
Mm-hmm.
relationship, then I strongly encourage that person to reach out to either their counselor, doctor, mentor, somebody that they trust who would have wisdom
Mm-hmm.
to add to the conversation, and talk to them confidentially about all the reasons why you're
Mm-hmm.
feeling unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're in that position, you need the help and support of someone else.
For
You need
sure.
somebody else's opinion, and you may need to make a safety plan. So
Mm-hmm.
I never personally want to be in the position of encouraging somebody to stay and to try to work out a
Mm-hmm.
marriage where, let's say, for example, there's domestic violence.
Sure.
So I'm so glad you asked me that question. If you're wondering whether, is this a harmful relationship or is it an unhappy one? I'm sure you could look at isolated points in my relationship with Carrie, and we were so inflamed, you could wonder whether it was actually harmful. Now,
Sure.
we were in conflict that was very mutual. There wasn't a big power imbalance, and we would definitely, get heated to the point where we would say things that we wished we hadn't said.
Sure.
And you could question whether, well, is this harmful or is it unhappy? I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. That distinction is very hard to make. If you are wondering, you need to reach out and have a
Mm-hmm.
conversation.
Right. Because I think that, we don't want to, and I know we're aligned in this, we don't want to diminish or minimize situations where, the rebuild is not a great solution. right? There is a
Mm,
need for safety reasons, and there's that nuance to the conversation. So I thought it might be important
yes.
to sort of just insert that here, to
Absolutely.
clarify that. But let's assume then that the person has determined this is an unhappy, not a harmful situation.
Yes.
And so
Hmm.
I'm concerned about that. I don't feel I can move forward. Speak to that person, and where you feel before you split can help them, or even just some encouraging words for them at that point in their
Hmm.
marriage.
Hmm. Well, I definitely identify with that unhappiness, with the deep unhappiness. When
Hmm.
Carrie and I went through that conflict for so long, and we're so like frustrated beyond words and feeling stuck, I wondered whether it was even possible for me to ever be in love with Carrie
Mm,
again.
right.
The conflict had really overtaken those feelings for me. I'll only speak for myself,
Hmm.
and so what I learned was that there were many ways that I was showing up in our marriage in with antagonism, maybe with cynicism. I was bringing some of that unhappiness myself. But
Hmm.
the problem is when you're unhappy, you can get into blame mode
Hmm.
and a victim mentality. So I would see this very routinely in my practice where the the client who was sitting in front of me would talk about all the ways that their spouse had let them down and what they were
Right.
doing. And, if they would only change X, or if they would do Y as I've been telling them to do it, but they won't do it, then things would be different. And
Mm.
the problem is that sometimes in that pain, it's like we wear prescription glasses that are not right for us. They're
Hmm.
not right for our eyes, so that when we look around, it's blurry and we miss the nuances.
Yes.
So I would encourage someone who's unhappy in their marriage right now to deliberately take off those glasses
Hmm.
and stop looking at what your spouse is responsible for and start to ask, what's my part? What is it that I can be responsible for? And I'll acknowledge that it's very hard to do when you're in that struggling place and you feel so hurt. The
Hmm.
reality is probably you are both hurting, and you
That's
may
right.
both be believing that the other person bears the majority of the blame.
Right.
But even if you would say, let's put it this way, let's just assume that your spouse is 95% responsible for what's
Right.
going on and you are 5% responsible. How can you take responsibility for that 5%
Right.
and do
Yes.
it with open hands, and do it even if it feels hard to do and you question, am I actually being authentic right now in
Hmm.
in trying to own my part in the context of all this hurt? um,
Right.
Push through those emotions,
Hmm.
because they're going to be there. You will feel resistance toward change. I think all of us feel a resistance toward any kind of positive change in our lives.
Sure.
Any change that involves growth also
Hmm.
involves pain
That's
in some
right.
way.
Yep. Absolutely. What comes to mind when you're speaking about that is, something that I heard, and I think it was in Gary Thompson's book, one of his books on marriage, but he talks about how, we have to ask ourselves the question, did we enter marriage to be loved or to be a lover? And
Mm-hmm.
to play with that question. And of course, so many of us, it's both. But what
Mm-hmm.
he brings to mind with that is that your only agency is over how you are loving, how you are
Yes.
offering love. And so, from a psychology standpoint, you would say, well, there's an external locus of control if the key to your happiness is in your partner's pocket. You don't have
Mm-hmm.
any agency over that. So, when you bring that back to the only part of my relationship that I have ownership over and responsibility over is how I'm choosing to love and how I'm
Mm-hmm.
showing up. and what I'm saying and doing in the relationship. And that's where I can affect the change. Even if it is, as you say, 5% of that, that's the
Mm-hmm.
internal agency that we have to
Yes.
how am I loving? And then
Mm-hmm.
hopefully in healthy relationships, of course, if both people are committed to that, you also have the beauty of being loved, right?
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
So,
And by owning that 5%, you have no idea how much influence that may have. Maybe not
right,
immediately, because your spouse is probably going to be, if you've really been stuck in conflict, a little suspicious, a little
right.
cynical.
What's
Is
this
this just
about?
a flash in the pan and it'll be
Yeah.
gone next week? But if you can be persistent with the change that you intend to make and show your
Hmm.
spouse the evidence that you are serious about it, you have no
Hmm.
idea how much influence that may have in changing
Hmm.
the trajectory of your marriage.
Absolutely. Like I talk about marriages being like ecosystems, right? And if you introduce something new into the ecosystem, it will take a while for that to find equilibrium. And it's very disruptive, maybe at first. And that's true of negative things and positive things. But,
Yes.
but it will find a new way of being and it will find, oh, this is actually a constant here of acknowledging, for example, the good things that are happening in the relationship and offering gratitude or appreciation. Something simple like that might be, why are you thanking me for all these? There's this suspicion, but then over
Yes.
time, it starts to be, oh, this is how we speak to each other now in this relation. This is
Hmm.
our ecosystem changing and growing, and creating actually a beautiful, um, space between us, and
Hmm.
consistency with so much change. It's consistency over time, whether that's relational change or change in our own, personal lives and goals. So yeah, I
Yes.
love, I love that. Yeah. I love the hopefulness of that. Like even that small, consistent changes and taking ownership over what you do and not getting caught in the blame shifting and just saying, this is what I can do towards supporting our marriage moving in a different direction.
Hmm.
That can be so empowering for people.
Hmm.
Even to the point where sometimes people will be in relationships and they'll say to us, like, I know we need marriage counseling, but like my spouse won't come. And so I will
Hmm.
often recommend to them, come for individual counseling that's focused on you processing what you can related to the relationship and start to do what you can do and see if that shifts things and there's a different openness in 6 months or a year if you're
Yes.
committed to that.
Yes. Yeah. I know of a couple who were pretty much on the brink of divorce because he was fed up. And the reason was that she was kind of like the bad college roommate. I mean, she
Mm,
just wouldn't, she had this kind of entitlement attitude where she felt that he should cook for her and he should do the cleaning and he should do the laundry. And he was fed up with it. So he was ready to walk. And this was finally a wake up call for her. And
hmm.
so she decided that, okay, I need to change my ways if I want to stay married. And so she did, one day clean up their apartment and she looked at him for a reaction and he was pretty cynical. It was like,
Hmm.
what's she up to? And, but then she recognized that, yes, she had made a change, but I can't expect instant results, that I am
Yes.
going to have to be patient and
Hmm.
show him that he can trust me over a longer period of time. And they ended up saving their marriage, but it also took her, her willingness to overlook the fact that he was not really thrilled at the beginning.
Right. Right. That's such a good word because, it is that patience over time and you won't have immediate reactions. These are mostly people who come for marriage counseling. And again, I would love for people to come sooner. Please do. But mostly people will come after years of struggle, and so patterns are not going to change overnight. And our reactions are not always going to be, well, I did that for you and you didn't even thank me. Like you can get into that cynicism. So it's again bringing it back to I'm going to do the thing that I believe is going to help in good faith that over time, the shift will change, the equilibrium will find itself, the ecosystem will adjust,
Mhm.
and that I'm not going to look for an instant um, manifestation of that being true. I'm going to just commit to the path and have that patience. It requires a lot of patience, for any
Mhm.
hard change in our lives, but for sure when it involves another person, because we have so many heart longings from that person. We want them, we want that attunement. They're supposed to be our person, right? So
Mhm.
we desperately want those changes. And so it's hard to be patient for them to grow again and to bloom, over time.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, Carrie and I have a mantra. It's slow is your friend. And
Love
it,
it.
yeah, it applies, if you are trying to bring a boat into a dock, the
Yes.
slower you can move, the more
Yes.
likely you are to be successful. And it just seems to be so generally applicable. And in this context, in the context of trying to rebuild and changing habits and patterns in your marriage, slow is your friend.
Hmm. Hmm. That's so funny. We have a friend who we like to do a bit of boating with, and we got him a keychain that said, "I apologize for what I said while I was docking the boat."
Yes.
But it's a good, it's like, we're going to get there. We're going to get into shore, but be patient. There's
Mhm.
slight moves, little
Mhm.
adjustments, I often think like that trajectory of, like, even with that boat analogy, of that 1 degree of difference over time lands you in a very different place, right? In terms of your
Mhm.
navigation.
Yes.
And so following your trajectory, yeah, you're not seeing it right now, but over time, you're going to be in a very different place in your relationship if you're adding these things in and taking these things out and relating to each other differently. So, and marriage is, supposed to be for the long haul. And so it is a lifelong trajectory. It's not an immediate instant gratification kind of relationship. And so
Mhm.
that commitment to the long range is so important. Great.
Yeah, and I would like to just add a note here of real encouragement for anyone who is in an unhappy marriage. Carrie and I were there for felt like a prolonged period of time. It was probably about 10 years. But at this point in our marriage, we would both say that we we are blown away literally by how great our relationship is and how it just exceeds any of the dreams or hopes we had when we were married.
Mm, right.
So the richness that comes with that length of experience with each other, if you're both willing to lean in and, even I would say that the harvest of love in our marriage goes beyond the tiny seeds of love that we planted. I feel like I made
Mm,
small deposits and I got disproportionate results.
right. I love that. Because again, it does give hope to people who, oh, you can be in that spot where you have given up all hope. You're despairing. You're not even sure if you can love that person, and find your way by doing the work and getting the help and having the commitment and vulnerability to that process. You're reaping this harvest of beauty in your marriage that is exceeding what came even before that in your early hopes, and I think that's true, for couples who go through various trials. What I always see is that if they're willing to go take that road, they're stronger, their relationship is deeper, they communicate better after going through a struggle, and you don't wish for having had to go through the struggle, but there is a gift in that if you persevere.
Hmm.
And so it's really beautiful. Well, we have one more question that I'll ask you quickly just for fun. So in this series, because we're talking to authors, we talk about a bedside book stack. And anybody who's a reader probably
Mm.
knows what I'm referring to, but mine is getting
Hmm.
disproportionately large. But we would love to hear just what's in your bedside book stack right now. What are the books that are capturing your attention that you're loving or being inspired by these days?
First one that comes to mind is William Urie's new book, Possible. Now,
Hmm.
Urie and Fisher wrote the the milestone book that's just been at the forefront of the negotiation field for years. It's called Getting to
Okay.
Yes. Getting to
Okay.
Yes is a foundational book in that negotiation field, but his new one, Possible, is a gem.
Wow.
It is actually, yeah, it's now my favorite book on resolving conflict. And he is such a world leader that he's been involved in the Middle East peace processes and family disputes, business disputes, international, even war settings. And so he has a lot to say. That's one of my current faves.
Wow.
Other than that, I have loved Ryan Holiday's "The Ego Is the Enemy." I have
Mm.
recently read "The War of Art" by Stephen Pressfield, and for any
Yes.
aspiring writer, that is a must read.
Hmm. Oh, I love those picks. I can tell now that my bedside book stack is going to grow after I have these conversations because I get so excited about a new book recommendation. And of course, we have the bookshop here at the store. And so we always love to include really great authors and like yourself, Toni, and others that you would recommend that are going to be helpful to people because there is so much that's available in book form, which is a really accessible point for people, right? To pick up a book that's
Hmm.
going to really be helpful to them. It's accessible at a time when, I think people are struggling economically to find resources and to be able to commit to that. So I love to have great books. So I will add those and we'll link those titles as well in the show notes. And so in terms of where people can find, obviously you can find your book here on the shelf at Covey Wellness Center, but if they wanted to connect with you, I don't know if it's possible for people to connect with you for your mediation services, or what would be the best way for people to find you and follow along with the work that you're doing, Toni?
Yes, there's a couple of ways. I do have a website. It's simply my name, Toni Nieuwhof. Now, Toni is with an I, and Nieuwhof, Nieuwhof is Niewhof. If you throw in almost any version of that, you will get my husband's name, Carrie Nieuwhof.
Right.
So, yes, it should be doable. Or
We'll
look
make
up
sure we link it
before
as
you
well.
split. We'll also do the trick.
Yes.
I have a podcast, and so you can reach me through my website for the Smart Family Podcast.
Okay.
I am completely ridiculously available on Instagram. So if you reach out to me on Instagram, I will be back to you. And the for mediation, the Mediation Center in Barrie is the organization I practice through.
Okay.
So a simple reach out to that center would connect us.
That's great. So we will make sure we get the spelling correct and link that in the show notes for people so they won't miss and they can connect with you in all those places because I'm sure they'll want to follow along with the work you're doing and with opportunities to work with you if that's in their needs right now. So we really appreciate that. Thank you again so much, Toni, for your time today. I've just enjoyed this. I think I'm so passionate about the health of relationships. I think that, it's central to the joy that we experience in our lives. And so it just deserves so much priority. And so I love that this conversation is an invitation to that hopefulness and that potential for a harvest of love. I just love that as a way to end. So thanks again for your time. And for those of you who are listening, if you are finding yourself in a spot where you're struggling, by all means, come and pick up a copy of Toni's book and see if that's a starting place for you, or reach out for some support. We have couples therapists here. We have individual therapists here at the center that are here to support you in navigating the challenges that you have. And if you're not struggling in your relationship, but you're hearing this conversation and thinking, I'd like to not wait 10 years before I connect, then reach out proactively in your marriage and start to build some tools and get some things that you can understand. Maybe do some personality work or some communication style work and learn to understand things that you can put in proactively in your relationship to really prioritize that. And so we're here for all of that at Covey Wellness Center, and we look forward to hearing from you and supporting you in whatever ways we can. Thanks again, Toni, and I look forward to the next time we get a chance to chat.
Oh, me too. This has been a pleasure. Thank you, Sarah.